Hi everyone, this is Matt Janda for Card Winners, and I'm here with my first hand and concepts quiz. Alright, so what are the goals for these videos? Well, firstly, I want them to be easier and more enjoyable to watch than most theory videos. Theory's gotten really popular in 2013, so there's a lot of people talking about it, there's a lot of people writing about it, so most people probably have access to good theory if they want. But learning theory is usually more difficult and for a lot of people less enjoyable. So for these videos, I don't want that to be the case. I want them to be, easier and comfortable to watch. So this is something you could do to, improve your poker game without thinking you need to go to a room that's completely quiet and have, a calculator, a pencil, and a piece of paper with you. They're not going to be as difficult to watch. They also require no previous knowledge. So a lot of times in series, I'll have like 6 or 7 videos, and it's hard to watch the 5th video if you haven't watched the first 4. You don't need to have watched the previous videos for these to know what's going on. And they're going to help you find your leaks. So one thing that's kind of difficult when you're talking about like theory or if you're explaining concepts is they don't show you leaks you don't know you have. So if you know your 3-bet pot play is not very good, it's not that hard for you to go find a video on 3-bet pot play and learn. But the problem is if you have a leak you don't know about, that's much more difficult to identify. And these videos will hopefully showcase the leaks you have that you didn't even know were there. And a lot of times these leaks we find might be pretty low-hanging fruit that are pretty easy to fix. Alright, so in other words, theory videos are designed to teach you new concepts. Quizzes are designed to show you leaks you didn't know you had through hand examples. Additionally, these videos will not usually focus on one specific concept. You should be able to recognize the relevant concepts for a given hand. If you can't, you'll know you have a leak and you need to discuss it. So if you can't figure out like why we're making the decision we're making, what concepts are at play, then that's usually a good indicator that you have a leak in your understanding of a certain aspect of poker, and just mention it in the forums and someone will help you. Probably me. The other thing is if I stick with a consistent theme in these videos, you'll notice a pattern and will likely get quiz answers right that you might misplay in practice, because you're going to be looking for a specific concept in the hands we're talking about. The randomness will add to the difficulty and hopefully mimic how real poker is played. So you're going to get a lot of different concepts, a lot of different situations coming at you at once in these videos. Hopefully that'll make it kind of fun, and hopefully it will help you identify leaks. So the last thing I want you to note is since you can't solve poker, a lot of these answers are just going to be what I think is best. I'll explain why I think it's best, and if you disagree with my explanation, feel free to explain why you disagree and nerd rage in the forums. I'm not going to just pick hand examples or concept examples that have like a super clear, easy answer, because that's usually not how you're going to learn as much. People want to see me talk about difficult spots, want to see me showcase hands that require you to be able to implement several different concepts at once. But whenever you talk about something that's difficult or close, there's always a greater chance that, there's more disagreement or I'm just straight out wrong. So just be aware of that. If that bothers you a lot, go ahead and mention it, but we're going to roll with it for now. All right, question number 1. You open on the button for 2.25 big blinds in 6 max, and only the big blind calls. Which of the 2 following hands make the best checks on a king of clubs, 7 of spades, 2 diamonds flop against a raggish opponent? Your options are the following. I would go ahead and pause right now and figure out what 2 hands you would check back in this situation, or if you don't check back 2, which hands you think would be the 2 best check backs if you had to check 2, and then, once you have your answer, unpause and listen to what I have to say. So the answer I have is A and C. And I think A is the easier one, which is to check back the ace of hearts, 8 of clubs. When you bet ace-8 off here, the hand does not retain its equity well as a bet. It will lose much of its showdown value by making hands like ace-high, which we beat, and queen-high fold. So when we bet ace-8 on this flop, we're making our opponent's range a lot stronger. And as we make our opponent's range a lot stronger, then he's going to get to the turn with more hands that are like pairs that beat us, rather than get to the turn with like ace-3, which we beat, or ace-4, which we beat, or, Queen 8, which we beat, or Jack 8, which we beat. All these hands that we beat, or a lot of the hands that we beat, are going to fold to our flop bet, so our hand's just not going to retain its equity very well. So yeah, it will make hands, it would dominate on an 8-turn fold, like we make Queen 8 fold, we make Jack 8 fold, we make 10 8 fold. And as I already mentioned, if our opponent does fold like Ace 3, Ace 4, and Ace 5 on the flop, those are also hands that if we were to turn an ace, we would have them outkicked, we'd have them dominated. And we might make those fold on the flop as well. Also, this hand has no robust equity component. In other words, it cannot make a very strong hand. This is problematic as we make our opponent's range stronger by betting. So, quite simply, when we bet, our opponent's going to fold his crappiest hands, so he's going to get to the turn with a stronger range, and Ace 8 just can't beat strong hands. It can't beat good hands in the opponent's range. So in order to play Ace 8 effectively, we really need to keep our opponent's range wide and keep those weak hands in his range, so that requires us to check back the flop. Now, there are times where we might want to bet every single hand in our range if our range is just that much better than our opponent's and we're that afraid of giving free cards, but I don't think that's the case here. So I think we're going to definitely check Ace 8. So, check back and hope your opponent checks future streets. Be prepared to sometimes call and play bluff catcher and hope to win at showdown. So a lot of the reason why people won't check back on this flop is because they're lost. They don't know what to do on the turn after they check back. But honestly, even if I bet on this flop with Ace 8, and then, the turn goes check, check, and my opponent bets the river, I'm still going to be lost. I'm still going to be folding the best hand sometimes. So I'd rather just check back the flop, keep his range wide, hope I turn an ace or an 8, or hope he checks on the turn and I get a win with my pretty good ace high. Now let's discuss answer B, which was 6-4 suited, which was not correct. We want to bet that on the flop. So this hand has a lot of robust equity. In other words, it will sometimes runner a very strong hand, such as the flush or the straight, that will win even if we make the opponent's range strong by betting multiple streets. If the opponent folds on the flop, he also always folded the best hand. 6 high is never good. And it's usually easy to tell when to keep betting on the turn. You're going to want to bet like a 5 turn, which gives you the open-ended straight draw, and you're going to want to bet a spade turn. And then if the turn card is a complete blank, like if the turn was, for example, let's just say a jack of diamonds here, then you can just probably check back on the turn and give up. So, Ace 8 is the exact opposite of 6-4 suited, because with 6-4 suited, we know if we're going to win at showdown, we probably have to make like a flush or a straight or something really, really good. So we don't mind betting 6-4 suited on the flop to make our opponent hopefully fold stronger hands, or even if he doesn't fold, we'll make the pot bigger and we'll occasionally get lucky on the turn and river. Ace 8 off is the exact opposite. It does very poorly when we make the opponent's range stronger, and it can't really get lucky on the turn and river, so that's a hand we should check back, whereas 6-4 suited we should bet. Alright, so this one I imagine most people got wrong, and I think I would have gotten it wrong about a year ago, and I would have bet this Jack 8 of hearts on the flop. I don't think it's a bet, though, and I want to explain why. Firstly, we need to check back some hands which can be used as bluffs later. I think this is a big leak a lot of players have, and when I say leak, I don't mean leak in the sense that you're getting exploited, so much as I mean it's a leak that if I know you're playing this way, I can exploit you. So if you're playing really low stakes, you probably can get away with, having this leak and not getting punished, but be aware that someone good could punish you. So, a leak that I think most people have is they don't check back like air hands when they think betting with any 2 cards will be profitable. So here, if we're on the button and we get a King 7-2 rainbow board, we probably can c-bet any 2 cards profitably against someone that cold called in the big blind. But just because we can c-bet any 2 cards profitably doesn't mean we should bet our entire range, and it doesn't mean we should bet our very, very weak hands all the time, because we do need to be able to bluff later. So we want to try to emphasize bluffing with hands with robust equity on the flop, so hands with the backdoor flush draws or straight draws, like 6-4 spades that I mentioned earlier, because these hands can get lucky and win large pots. Jack 8 of hearts, though, is pretty much total garbage. If we check back and our opponent bets the turn, we can fold and not feel bad about it. And if he checks multiple times, we can bluff later, such as on the river, when our bluff quality doesn't matter. So, on the flop, we want some hands that can get really lucky on the turn in the river. So we want to be bluffing with hands that have robust equity. But if we're bluffing on the river, all bluffs are pretty much the same. yeah, a removal effect might matter a little bit. But for the most part, if our hand has no showdown value, all of the bluffs are going to be the same. There's no like good bluffs and bad bluffs on the river like there are on the flop. So visualize this for a moment. You're going to need to bluff with some hands that check back the flop, check back the turn, and then bluff the river. Now, that could be a hand that started off with some showdown value, and then based on the way the board ran out, it's now not good enough to check back on the river, and then you bluff with it. That's totally fine. So maybe, for example, sometimes you'll check back even like an ace-high hand that needs to bluff later. That can make sense. But another hand that works really well as like checking back the flop, then checking back the turn, and then bluffing on the river is just a bluff that's complete garbage. Because the river's a street where we can bluff, and our bluff quality won't matter. So if I have a complete garbage hand like Jack of Hearts, Eight of Hearts here, I often will check it back on the flop because I say, hey, I need to check back some hands on the flop that can bluff later. This hand looks reasonable for that. Additionally, I really like the fact that if I check back the flop and my opponent bets on the turn, I just insta-muck this hand and don't care. Like if, let's say the turn is a 3 of hearts. If my opponent bets the turn after I check back the flop, I just insta-muck this hand. It's complete garbage. I don't have to feel bad about folding a hand where I'm like, I kind of wish I could call, but I think it's slightly negative EV. Whereas if we're only checking back hands on the flop that are like, really weak pairs, ace high, then when we face that turn bet, we don't really have a lot of hands that we can just insta-muck and not feel bad about it. So this also does something nice for our turn range, which is it gives us a hand that can not only effectively bluff if our opponent checks, but if our opponent bets, we just insta-muck and don't feel bad about it. We don't have to fold, a hand with a reasonable amount of equity. Also note, we cannot only check back hands on the flop with showdown value. I just mentioned that by saying checking back hands that are either weak pairs or ace high. We need some hands that can bluff later. So this is another problem that I think a lot of players have is when they check back on this like King 7-2 rainbow board, they're either checking back hands that, aren't afraid of giving free cards but don't want 3 streets of value, like, pocket queens, pocket jacks, or they're checking back ace-high hands, but they don't really have any hands in their flop checking range that make really effective bluffs on the turn or the river, because all the hands they check back have showdown value. So I do like checking this hand, but by the same token, and this is another detailed thing, it is possible that you would want to bet some very weak hands on the flop and check some very weak hands on the flop to bluff later. So I don't want you to look at this hand example and think, oh, Matt said never bluff crap hands on the flop. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying you often do need to check back crap hands to bluff later, and because they're very easy to fold when you face a bet on the turn of the river. So sometimes you have to do a mixture of things, and it depends on your range and the flop texture, but you should consider checking back like the really, really weak hands in a lot of situations to bluff later. So that's why I like checking this back here. All right, and then the last option was pocket sixes, which I believe we should bet on the flop, though I think it's probably pretty debatable. And I'm going to explain why in just one second. But one thing I do want to make clear is, I think with like the last example where I had Jack 8 of hearts, I think most people would say like, oh yeah, that makes sense why you should check it back on the flop, or at the very least, it's pretty clear why you should be checking back some garbage hands that can fold to a turn bet or bluff later. And I think most people would get on board with that. Whereas with pocket sixes, I could see people who bet it being more passionate about why it's a bet, and people that check it being more passionate why it's a check, which is why I think this one might be a little bit more debatable. Whereas some people will prefer a bet here, whereas others will prefer a check. I want to explain why I think it's a bet, though. I think you can get value from hands like pocket fives, pocket threes, and ace-high hands. And I also think you need some hands that can bet the flop, check the turn, and sometimes call the river. So one thing that's probably a good idea for you to do is ask yourself, like, what hands are you betting on the flop that will check on the turn and then call a river bet? And you probably can think of some. They'll probably most likely be like 7x hands. Even pocket eights might get bet twice, but maybe some 7x hands you'd bet on the flop, check back on the turn, and then call a river bet. But the thing is, like, a lot of ace 7 and like queen 7 and jack 7 hands, I would be pretty likely to check back on the flop. Because, if I have ace 7, for example, I can get value by betting a later street, and I like it if I, check back, ace 7 or queen 7 or jack 7 on the flop, and then, my opponent turns an ace, queen, or jack, in which case I have 2 pair and he has 1 pair usually, and I might win like a medium-sized pot that I would not have won if I just bet the flop and made him fold. So, I do check back a lot of 7s here, so I like betting the 6s. And then if the opponent folds on this flop, he'll frequently have folded a hand with 2 overcards. So one thing that I have to even like correct myself here is I think to myself when I, think of pocket 6s like, oh, well, pocket 6s are in overcards like 5s, 4s, and 3s. But most, or I shouldn't say most, a lot of hands that have a 5, a 4, a 3 in it are either going to be folded by the opponent pre-flop or he's going to have 3-bet them pre-flop. So, for example, I don't think our opponent can have 5-4 suited because he probably would have 3-bet it pre-flop. I don't think he can have 5-4 off because I think he probably folds it pre-flop. So, when we do bet on the flop with 6s and we make our opponent fold, it is often going to be a hand like Jack-9 or Jack-8 or something that has 2 overcards. We also already have hands that can sometimes check back the flop and call bets on later street, which keep dominated hands in the opponent's range that aren't the 7x hands I talked about previously. So like Ace-10, Ace-9, and Ace-8. If I check back Ace-9 and the turn card comes a 9 or an Ace, and my opponent makes a pair and so do I, I'm pretty much always going to outkick him. If we both turn an Ace, he probably has like Ace-8, Ace-6, Ace-5. If we both turn a 9, he probably has like Queen-9, Jack-9, 10-9. So these hands, in my opinion, are a little bit better to check back, whereas 6s are a little bit better to bet. And then lastly, our opponent probably won't check raise at a high frequency here, since it's pretty easy for him to slow play his strong hands, and he probably doesn't have King-2 off or 7-2 off in his range. So I won't very often bet this flop with 6s, face a check raise, and then go, ugh. Because that's something that really, really sucks against a good player is when you bet 6s and you face a check raise. Because he easily can be bluffing and then you end up folding the best hand, or he could be just doing it for value, in which case you're pretty much drawing dead. You're drawing to a 6. But since our opponent's not going to be check raising that aggressively here, it's less likely we'll, bet here, have our opponent check raise bluff, and then have to fold. And if we're being honest, I imagine the vast majority of players watching this video, if they bet 6s on this flop, they're going to fold it without a second thought. So, it does suck when we bet 6s here and get check raised, because if our opponent was check raised bluffing, he made us fold the best hand. Alright, so let's say you got this wrong. And when I say you got this wrong, I mean, you've listened to my description, you pretty much agree with me now, and you're not able to successfully, in your opinion, argue for why other choices are better. So if you got this wrong, make sure you understand that just because betting any 2 cards is profitable does not mean you should bet. Think about what a check back from your opponent on a King 7-2 rainbow board looks like. It looks like he has a hand with showdown value such as Ace-10, Queen-7, or King-2 suited, so when he bets later, you'll usually correctly assume he's weighted towards value. You can exploit regs by checking back air to bet later. Also, it's likely correct in theory. It's nice to have some hands which comfortably fold to turn bets, or can be used as bluffs on the river when hand quality doesn't matter. I'll tell you right now, people that check back air in position on like a King 7-2 rainbow board probably exploit me pretty well, because I don't think enough people are capable of doing that with air hands. I think most people bluff them on the flop, so if you are capable of checking back air hands on this board, it would exploit someone like me. Alright, so let's move on to the second question. So let's assume you open in the button to 2.25 big blinds and the big blind 3 bets. Which of the following hands is least likely to be part of an optimal 4-betting range? Is it A, Ace-Queen? Is it B, Pocket Jacks? Is it C, Queen-9 suited? Or is it D, King-3 suited? Pause for a moment and think, and then I'm going to discuss why I think what I do. Alright, so the answer is C, which was Queen-9 suited. So why don't I want to 4-bet this hand? Well, the hand works best as a call. It's reasonably easy to play boards where we flop a pair, and calling keeps the opponent's dominated 9x hands involved. So like 9-8 suited, 9-7 suited, 9-6 suited, 9-5 suited. Additionally, the opponent could even have 3-bet with a couple of suited queens that we outkick. Like maybe he sometimes 3-bets Queen-3 or Queen-2 suited rather than calls with them, in which case we keep those dominated hands involved as well. If we 4-bet this hand using the logic that we only need to defend better, we're almost certainly going to be folding way too much. So we're probably going to have to mathematically defend this. Alright. So just be aware that if you are opening the button reasonably wide, 45%, 50%, some people open even more than that, you're probably not going to be able to get away with releasing this hand, or else your opponent's going to be able to exploit you if he's capable of doing that. So this hand's probably a pretty standard call. Let's look at the other options. So ace-queen can be 4-bet for value. I'm doing that little, in quotation thing with my hand because the term value doesn't work that well here. But you can 4-bet ace-queen since an optimal player likely 3-bets king-queen, king-jack, ace-jack, and ace-10, and many of these hands will call our 4-bet, especially if we 4-bet small. Also, ace-queen doesn't hate it when the opponent folds 2 live cards. So if you do 4-bet and make your opponent fold 9-6 suited, that's cool. 9-6 suited was going to outdraw you a lot of the time. So I'm not saying you should always 4-bet ace-queen here or that, in theory, ace-queen is a 4-bet. But I think it pretty likely is, or at least a mixed strategy where you should 4-bet ace-queen against an optimal opponent, I think at least some fraction of the time. And that's because you're going to be 4-betting small in theory, and then the opponent should have 3-bet with like king-queen, king-jack, ace-jack, and ace-10 from the blinds. And then we put more money in the pot against them, and we also make our opponent fold a lot of hands that can outdraw us. Now, there are some big drawbacks to 4-betting ace-queen too. It sucks when our opponent, 5-bets and we're close to indifferent to calling if we face a 5-bet, or even if we're not close to indifferent to calling, even if we can profitably call, we might just get shown ace-king sometimes, and that sucks. But there is a lot of merit to 4-betting ace-queen against an aggro 3-better. Jacks can pretty easily get value from weaker hands, so Jacks is, I think, a pretty standard 4-bet. I don't imagine anyone has trouble with that. Also, you can make the opponent fold even 1 live card, and that's pretty useful. So sometimes if you 4-bet ace-jack, you might make your opponent fold a, suited queen or king if he happened to 3-bet those hands. Maybe he even rarely 3-bets some offsuit stuff that has an ace or a king, and again, if you make them fold that, that's cool too. King 3 suited works pretty well as a 4-bet bluff. It may not be strong enough to call, but it has a nice little removal effect, and if the opponent calls the 4-bet, the king may be live. So, for example, maybe your opponent 3-bet with 10s, you 4-bet him with king 3 suited, he calls, you can spike the 10 sometimes. So I think king 3 suited is a pretty reasonable hand to 4-bet bluff here, whereas if I had ace 3 suited, I would probably call. So that's my reasoning for why I like calling the queen 9 suited, whereas the other ones I think you can take other lines. All right, question 3. The button opens to 2.25 big blinds, and you call with king of hearts, 7 of clubs in the big blind. The flop comes ace of hearts, 6 of hearts, 5 of diamonds. If you check and the opponent bets 3 big blinds into a 5 big blind pot, what should you do? Well, you should be familiar with all 3 of these options. D is not really a real option. I just wanted a D. If you did pick D, you've got some pretty big leaks. All right, so pause for a moment and think, and then see what I have to say. I think you should check raise here, and I'm going to explain why. The flop was ace of hearts, 6 of hearts, 5 of diamonds, and you had king of hearts, 7 of clubs. That's 3 to the nut flush and 3 to the straight. And just remember, when you think 3 to the flush, 3 to the straight, it doesn't need to be like 3 to the straight flush. And if you're defending in the big blind, it often won't be. You just need 3 flush cards and 3 straight cards. They don't need to be consecutive. They don't need to be straight flush cards. All right, so you have many realistic value hands you would check raise here. How many ace-6 and ace-5 combos would you have here? Well, if the button opens and you called in the big blind, you probably have all your ace-6 off and all your ace-5 off. So you can, really represent a lot of 2-pair combos here when you check raise. The next question I would ask is, what hands are you check raise bluffing here? Most of your gut shots, such as 9-8 suited, and gappers, such as 9-7 suited, probably got 3-bet pre-flop. Some people might call with these hands, and that could be fine, but I personally would 3-bet them, and I think a lot of people that are watching this would too. So as such, this is probably one of the best bluff randomizers you can have. This isn't like middle position versus cutoff, where you cold called and open in the cutoff. You just don't have that many, pretty suited connectors and suited gappers in your cold calling range. They usually got 3-bet pre-flop, and your range is really wide. So this randomizer actually works very well. And then this part's really key, I think. The showdown value of king 7 probably isn't good enough to try to check down and win. So check calling king 7 to retain its showdown value is not likely correct. So think about it for a second. One thing that might make me not want to check raise bluff here with king 7 would be for me to think to myself and say, hey, but you know what? King 7 might already be the best hand. And, if I check raise bluff king 7, then I might make my opponent fold like a queen high or a jack high hand, and, I was ahead of those hands. But in order to use that logic, you have to ask yourself, Are you actually going to let yourself check down with King 7 on the turn in the river and try to utilize your showdown value? Because if the answer is no, then your showdown value is not very good. If the answer is no, then your showdown value is irrelevant because you're not going to actually go to showdown with the hand. So what I mean by that is, like, let's say the turn's a 9 and the river's a 3. If you're going to bluff King 7 on the river after you check called, then you can't, make the argument that it was good to check call King 7 on the flop because it had showdown value, because you're not utilizing it. So here, I don't think King 7 is a strong enough showdown hand to try to check through, because I think you're going to end up losing to just random pairs too often and just even some king high hands that have us outkicked. So because of that, I don't think we want to check call to retain its showdown value. I think we want to check raise bluff it because we have the robust equity in the form of the 3 to the nut flush and 3 to the straight. All right, so what's the take-home message here? Most people autopilot when playing. So let's say you're playing No Limit 200 on PokerStars against a regular who opened the button and the flop came ace of hearts, 6 of hearts, 5 of diamonds. In reality, the person you're playing against is probably playing many tables and will frequently auto-bet here because it's profitable and because he'll often just have a hand that works well as a bet. So maybe he just has a gut shot like 9-7 of spades, for example. It's unlikely he'll actually stop and think, whoa, my opponent can actually represent a lot of two-pair combinations here, and since he 3-bets lots of pseudo-connectors and gappers, it's somewhat hard for him to have obvious bluffs. He will, however, likely realize these things after you check raise him, and if he has a hand which is close. So, for example, if he bets the flop and has pure garbage, he's just going to auto-muck and he's going to continue to auto-play without thinking. But if he has a marginal hand or marginal draw, he'll likely now focus on your specific table and start thinking. Most winners at No Limit 200 on Stars are pretty good players, and they will be capable of realizing you represent many two-pair combinations and don't have too many obvious bluffs. This will make him more likely to fold. And King of Hearts, 7 of Clubs is probably a bluff in theory anyways, so check raising here is probably going to be highly profitable. So what I really want to stress here is most people, if they're a winning reg, they're playing a lot of tables at once, and they don't stress or think as hard as they can over every decision. It's impossible for them to do that. They don't have the time. Their brain will quickly become exhausted if they're trying to do that for every single table, for every single decision. So it's pretty reasonable to expect your opponent to bet, pretty loosely on this ace of hearts, 6 of hearts, 5 of diamond board. But once you check raise him, if someone's winning at No Limit 200 on Stars, they're probably pretty good, and they will start realizing, oh, wait a second, if my opponent check raised me here, he's going to have a lot of ace-6 and ace-5 because those hands cold call in the big blind. They'll also probably be able to realize that it's hard for you to have a lot of bluffs, so that will make them a little bit more likely to fold if the decision seems close. So just be aware of that. I think this is probably a bluff in theory, but I think especially in practice, this would be a really good hand to check raise bluff against pretty good regulars. All right, question number 4, and it's a continuing question from question number 3, so get excited.
Oh, baby.
Suppose we check raise this King of Hearts, 7 of Clubs on the Ace of Hearts, 6 of Hearts, 5 of Clubs board, and the turn comes the Jack of Diamonds. What should we usually be doing here? A, keep betting. B, check fold. C, check raise. Or D, check call. Pause for a moment and think, and then I'm going to tell you what I think we should do. Answer B, which was to check fold. So in general, we want to keep bluffing here when we have a hand that has some equity. So we'll usually bluff with any draws we have on the turn. They can be draws we had on the flop that we check raise, such as the flush draw, or draws we picked up on the turn, in the case we turned a straight draw or a flush draw. For the most part, if you randomize your flop check raise bluffs well, you'll be able to check fold the majority of your total garbage hands, and your betting range will still be pretty balanced. So let me explain exactly what I mean by this. So here's the take-home message, and then I'll go into a bit more detail. General rule of thumbs will usually not be super precise, but they are quite useful. You need to be willing to sometimes bluff your entire stack. Most small stake players don't do this nearly enough, but don't do that recklessly. I'll usually check fold my garbage hand and keep betting my semi-bluffs and value hands after check raising the flop. Don't bluff a near zero equity hand without a good reason. Note it's dangerous to apply a rule like this heads up where hands qualities change, so be careful. So when you're playing 6-max, usually when you're raising on the flop in position, or if you're check raise bluffing, you're doing it with hands that can pretty often improve on the turn or turn a pretty good draw. So when you do bluff on the flop, you usually want to keep bluffing on the turn if you have a hand that has a reasonable amount of equity. You don't usually want to keep bluffing if you have like a complete garbage hand, because there'll usually be enough reasonable hands in your range to keep bluffing with that are better bluffs. So if we look at this example, I'll be the first one to admit the Jack of Diamonds really didn't put that many good draws into our range, right? It didn't like let us turn a flush draw. It wasn't a club or anything. It didn't really probably improve. It didn't really give us any more straight draws, because the only gut shots it could have given us would have been if we check raised like King 10 or Queen 10 on the flop, which might not be very likely. We could have, but it's probably not that many combos if we did. But on this specific turn, I still feel I'm usually going to have enough flush draws that I check raised on the flop and enough like random gut shots that I'm probably okay with just check folding most, if not all, of my pure garbage hands. Someone could tell me, and they could totally be right, that if I never keep bluffing with any of my like pure garbage hands on the turn here, maybe I'm not bluffing quite enough, but I'm not that good, and I'm not trying to be that precise on every single board texture. So here I'm just going to stick with my general rule of thumb, which is, hey, if I check raise on the flop, and I'm, or if I raise on the flop in position, and if I'm using usually the right type of hands, I can, keep barreling when I improve and get a draw on the turn, and I can just give up when I don't. That rule usually works really nicely. There are some exceptions, but it's a good rule to follow, and it's what I'll usually do if I'm playing. The one thing I did want to throw out there is when you are playing heads-up poker, this is a leak I noticed I had heads-up not too long ago. With heads-up poker, you're often raising hands that are a lot weaker. You don't always have like 3 to a flush and 3 to a straight type of stuff. So with heads-up, maybe sometimes I'm going to have to, double or triple barrel with a hand that doesn't have as many good outs. Because with heads-up, my bluff raises might be weaker hands. So just be aware when you are using general rule of thumbs, you need to be careful with them. But in most situations, on most board textures, with most turn cards and 6-max, I think this is going to be a rule that you find pretty useful. Just, follow through with your bluff if you're 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight, and prove to a better draw on the turn. All right, so question number 5 I like a lot, so hopefully you'll like it too. You open to 2.5 big blinds in the cutoff, and the button calls. The flop comes Jack of clubs, 9 of hearts, 4 of hearts. We bet, and our opponent calls. The turn is the 2 of diamonds. Which of the following hands make the best overbet on this turn? Is it A, pocket aces with an ace of hearts? Is it B, pocket aces without the ace of hearts? Is it C, pocket queens with the queen of hearts? Or is it D, pocket queens without the heart? Go ahead and take a moment to pause and think which one makes the best overbet. We were looking for D, so that was the queens without the hearts. So, on the Jack of clubs, 9 of hearts, 4 of hearts board, we want to overbet the queens without the heart. It's the best overbet. And that's because ideally, we want to overbet hands that cannot ever or almost ever be beaten. Well, that qualifies for all of our hands, right? Any pocket aces or any pocket queens can't realistically be beaten on this board with the offsuit 2 turn. But it's best to overbet with the strong yet very vulnerable hands. Queens fit this description perfectly since we can easily be outdrawn on a heart, king, and ace river. Hands with a heart and pocket aces are simply less likely to be outdrawn than queens without a heart. In other words, it's riskier giving a free card with pocket aces than pocket queens, since pocket aces will more likely remain the best hand on a king or ace river. So you could overbet all of these hands on the turn, and I've talked about a lot in other videos how you can use multiple different bet sizings, but I'm going to go back to the last slide. But the one that I really like it when I see people overbet is like these really vulnerable queens right here, because they're pretty much never going to be beat. And then, if we overbet queens and we make our opponent fold, it might not be ideal, but it's not really that bad. Whereas if we overbet with aces and we make our opponent fold, especially if we had the ace of hearts, I'm now less excited about making him fold because I was less likely to be outdrawn. For example, if our opponent has king queen and we have pocket queens, if the river card comes king, we lose. Whereas with pocket aces, if the river card comes king, we get additional value from our opponent. Queens also get bonus points for removing fewer ace-jack hands from the opponent's range, since he'll almost always call an overbet with these hands. I usually go over the slides like a week or at least a couple days after making them. I don't remember writing this point down, so it just struck me as a surprise when I was reading it just now, but that's actually a pretty good point, which I wasn't even thinking about. If we overbet, the best hand in our opponent's range is usually going to be ace-jack, so he'll want to call with those. But if we have pocket aces, we're not only not vulnerable to ace-jack, but we're blocking his ace-jack combos. So with pocket aces, we'd want to bet smaller, whereas with pocket queens, let's bet bigger, let's get more value from those ace-jack hands. So what's the take-home message? It's don't be afraid to overbet in this spot. If your opponent has you beat, and it doesn't matter which of those hands, the pocket aces or the pocket queens, with or without the heart, if the opponent has us beat, you're likely going to get raised on the turn and stacked anyways. So betting smaller won't save you money, because as soon as you bet that turn card and get raised, you're going to say to yourself, how does my opponent have me beat? Aces and queens are very, very strong hands in our range. You're likely not going to get away from them. So, you're going to get stacked more likely than not, no matter what size you bet if your opponent has you beat on the turn. And you might say, well, it's easy to say we should almost never be beat here in theory, but I have been beaten before in practice. Sure, we all have. But when players make mistakes, it goes both ways. So everybody may allow you to stack your opponent with a silly hand as well. Maybe he'll spaz and jam with a bad draw, and then you just call him off when you have your pocket queens or your pocket aces or whatever you did overbet on the turn. Take the opportunity to use excellent bet sizing to gain an edge now while you still can. Don't be afraid to get stacked. In 3 or 5 years from now, it's unlikely players will keep either betting 2/3 of the pot or checking like many regulars are now. So again, all the hands are probably pretty reasonable to overbet, but I do actually think since pocket aces block ace-jack, it's probably a little bit better not to overbet them, whereas I really like overbetting with queens. But the main thing to take home here is the thing that really stops people from overbetting is I think they either don't think to do it, so you should always think to yourself, hey, if my opponent's never going to raise here, should I overbet? So as soon as you think your opponent won't have a raising range, consider overbetting. But yeah, people usually won't overbet because they don't think to do it, or because they just say to themselves like, well, the problem is I can sometimes get beat here, and if I overbet and I can beat here, I'm going to get stacked. But you got to be honest with yourself. Usually you're going to get stacked either way. If you have a hand which you think should never be beaten, and your opponent happened to slow play a really strong hand on a really scary board. So don't be afraid to overbet here. Hand C-ace. We open in the cutoff to 2.5 big blinds, and our opponent calls in the button. What hand works most poorly as a check call on the 10 of hearts, 5 of hearts, 3 of clubs flop? Is it A, the ace of hearts, ace of clubs? Is it B, the jack of diamonds, jack of clubs? Is it C, the ace of diamonds, king of spades? Or is it D, the jack of diamonds, 10 of diamonds? Again, pause this, try to get this right, and, think for a minute if you're not sure, if it doesn't immediately pop out to you, which one's going to work best. So, yeah, just pause for a moment. The answer is B. Jack-Jack should almost certainly be bet here. Betting is justified for several reasons. It's a strong and vulnerable hand. It only loses to sets, but many of the opponent's hands have 1 or 2 overcards. So rarely are we beat on the flop, and if we do make our opponent fold, we have to make him fold a hand that has a reasonable amount of equity. And remember, just because he won't fold hands with 2 overcards on the flop doesn't mean he won't fold them on the turn. So even if you say to yourself, like, if we look at this last board, even if you say to yourself, like, well, I don't think betting jacks is all that good here because my opponent's not going to fold ace, queen, or king, queen, maybe. That might be true. He'll probably fold some king, queen, but even if he doesn't, we can make them fold when we bet on the turn. So we bet the flop with pocket jacks, our opponent calls with ace, queen, the turn card comes in 8, we bet again, and then he folds. So keep that in mind. It's a multi-street game. All right. And ace, so let's go over the other options. Pocket aces with a heart can comfortably slow play and allow the opponent to runner a dominated flush. So both betting and checking here are fine. I'm probably going to bet more often than I check, to be honest, but it's reasonable to check call with aces here with a heart because we're not really afraid of being outdrawn, and it is pretty freaking awesome if you do check call, turns a heart, you check call again, and then like the river hits a heart, or you just, have a removal effect to your opponent's, nut flushes and stuff like that. Actually, I don't want to get into the whole removal effect thing there. It's more complicated than that. What I'm trying to get at is it's nice to check call with aces with a heart sometimes because your opponent can turn and river a dominated flush, and because your opponent can just, if we check with jacks and the turn card comes a queen, that sucks. If we check with aces and the turn card comes a queen, that's usually fine. We're still going to have the best hand if he has a pair of queens. Okay, ace, king off also can work as a check call because it keeps dominated hands in the opponent's range and isn't really that vulnerable to giving free cards. Betting and checking are both fine. In reality, when you have a hand like ace-king that makes up so many combos, it's 15 combos total if we don't count the flush draw, then it's probably a safe guess that the GTO line with this hand is a mixed strategy. Meaning with ace-king, this is a hand that I wouldn't really fault you if you bet it. I wouldn't really fault you if you check call it. They're both reasonable. I could list several reasons why I like check calling, and I can list reasons why I like betting. I especially like check calling with ace-king because it allows us to, really keep the showdown value of the hand, and it lets our opponent turn a river like a dominated pair of aces or kings if an ace or king turns, but it also can make sense to bet, so we do, improve ourselves on ace and king turns. Jack 10 of diamonds blocks one of the overcards and isn't that strong. So it's a good hand to check call for these reasons. So the ace king I could go either way with on the flop. Pocket aces I would usually bet. Jack 10 I would usually check call. So let's talk a little bit more about that. There's 4 overcards on the 10 high board. The jack, the queen, the king, and the ace. But if we have jack 10, the jack is obviously good, so there's only 3 bad overcards. So in a way, it blocks a quarter of the overcards because now, a jack turning is not bad. It's a very good thing. So that's nice. And honestly, jack 10 is just not that strong. It's a strong enough hand that it could bet the flop and we could check call the turn. That's fine. I don't want you to think, even though I said I usually check call it on the flop, I don't want you to think it's bad to, bet jack 10 on the flop and check call the turn. I don't think it's a bad line. But jack 10 is not a strong hand that's really going to want to get multiple bets in. So by check calling it, it's not a super vulnerable hand. The king, the ace, and the queen are all bad turns, but it's not a super vulnerable hand, and it's not so strong that, if it checks through on the flop, I didn't want 3 rounds of betting to go in anyways. So if it checks through on the flop, the turn card's an 8, then we can start betting for value. So jack 10 would be, I think, a very reasonable hand to check call on the flop. So the only hand out of the 4 options that I think would be a bad check call, and I think it would actually be a very bad check call, is pocket jacks. All right, hand number 7. Middle position opens to 3 big blinds, and we call in the button. If he bets 5 big blinds on a 9 of clubs, 5 of spades, 3 of spades board, which of the following 2 hands would I be least likely to raise with? So if the pot's going to be 7.5 big blinds, he's betting 5 big blinds for 2/3 of the pot. Which hand do I think it makes the worst positional raise? Is it ace, king off? 6, 7 of hearts? Pocket 5s for middle set? Or pocket 6s for a middle pair? Pause for a moment and think. So, not a particularly easy question. It was actually pretty hard. But on a 9 of clubs, 5 of spades, 3 of spades board, I'm least likely to raise with the ace-king off. The reason for this is because raising likely makes the opponent fold some hands we dominate, like if you c-bet ace-queen, ace-jack, and king-queen. Additionally, ace-king only has outs to a pair. So in other words, ace-king has what I would call non-robust equity here. And by non-robust equity, I mean a pair is unlikely to win as we make our opponent's range much stronger. So if we have non-robust equity, that simply means, hey, we have a good amount of equity on the flop with ace-king, but as we make our opponent's range much stronger, we're going to start losing our equity pretty quickly because the hands that are in our opponent's range that we have a lot of equity against, such as ace-queen, ace-jack, king-queen, those are the hands we make fold with a raise. So to say that one more time, robust equity is something like a straight draw, where it doesn't really matter if we make our opponent's range stronger. If we hit our draw, we're always pretty much going to win. Non-robust equity is equity that when we do make our opponent's range stronger, now we're less likely to win. So, ace-king, again, only makes a pair here, and it has a showdown value of, ace-king high. If we make our opponent's range much stronger, then not only when we turn a pair are we going to be less likely to win, but also, we're just going to be much, much less likely to win with just the ace-king high. So I don't want to make my opponent's range stronger when I hold ace-king. So in contrast, 7 of hearts, 6 of hearts, and pocket sixes both have more robust equity. In other words, they can make more really strong hands. 7, 6 of hearts can make straights. An 8 or a 4 that's not a spade give the 7, 6 of hearts the nuts. And pocket sixes can make straights, sets, and weak flushes. So, I don't want to get too off topic, but pocket sixes is a pretty complicated example here because pocket sixes have a non-robust equity component, which is just the pair of sixes. So if we raise pocket sixes, we are going to make our opponent fold a lot of hands which we beat, like, his ace-jack and his king-queen and maybe his ace-queen. But by the same token, those hands also had a lot of outs against us, so it's not really like it's that bad. But in addition to the sixes just being a pair of sixes, they're also kind of 3 to a straight, 3 to a weak flush, and then obviously we have set outs, and so it's possible we can raise our opponent on the flop with pocket sixes, then get a really lucky turn or river and make a super strong hand with pocket sixes, and that would be the robust equity component, like when we turn a 4 and river a 7. And then the last reason, which I think is a pretty big one, is the opponent will often double and triple barrel on the ace and the king when we have improved. Those are the scare cards people like to keep firing on, and so when we turn an ace or a king and we call with ace-king, we can just call down very comfortably, and our opponent's going to be likely to be bluffing or even value betting the worst hand. The last thing I should point out is it's totally fine to call on the flop with 7 of hearts, 6 of hearts as well. Both raising and calling can make sense. So don't really have too strong of an opinion there. I honestly probably would usually call with it, but with the ace-king example, I would pretty much breathless, I'm just always going to call with ace-king. Whereas with 7, 6 of hearts, I think that one's more debatable because it does have really, really robust equity, but also what sucks is when we raise with 7 and 6 of hearts and our opponent 3-bets. So, again, this was a tricky example, or this was a tricky question, I think, because the 7, 6 of hearts and the pocket sixes specifically, they're pretty complex spots to talk about. Okay, so hand number 8. You open to 3 big blinds in the cutoff, and the big blind calls. The flop comes 10 of spades, 8 of spades, 4 of clubs, and you bet and your opponent calls. Which of the following turn cards is most reasonable to frequently overbet? Is it A, the 10 of diamonds, B, the 4 of diamonds, C, the 8 of diamonds, or D, the 5 of spades? So this one's a little bit more straightforward. I don't think the answer is too difficult here, but still pause for a moment and think to try to make sure you get it right. And the answer is B, the 4. So on a 10 of spades, 8 of spades, 4 of clubs board, it's most acceptable to overbet the 4 of diamonds turn. Why? Quite simply, it didn't improve almost any, if not literally didn't improve any, hands in the opponent's range. He could have easily check-called with a 10, an 8, or a flush draw, all of which improved on the different turn cards, but there are, however, very few 4x hands in his range. And remember, even if our opponent can occasionally have us beat, so maybe sometimes he will have ace 4 suited or king 4 suited, that's only 4 combos total here. It's okay to bet bigger than the pot even when we'll occasionally be beaten. So as I mentioned earlier, you really want to consider overbetting in spots where your opponent won't ever raise you. And honestly, if I open in the cutoff and my opponent calls in the big blind, I'm never expecting to get raised on this 4 of diamond turn. I do expect to get raised on a 10 turn, an 8 turn, and a spade turn sometimes, but never the 4 of diamonds turn. Sometimes I am going to run into these ace 4 suited or king 4 suited hands. They could, it's reasonable for those hands to probably be called in the big blind against a cutoff open. They're at least close. And sometimes my opponent might have them and raise me, but just because I can very rarely be beaten, that's not enough to really slow me down. Especially if I had a hand like pocket jacks on the turn or pocket queens. If somehow my opponent has those hands beaten, I'm really going to lose a massive pot, if not get stacked, regardless of whether or not I overbet or if I bet smaller, because when my opponent raises on the turn, I'm going to say, how does my opponent have me beat when I have pocket jacks and he check called me on this flop? Because it'd be very hard for him to slow play a set, and if he did slow play a set, he'd probably keep slow playing it on this turn card. So this is a good spot. The 4 diamonds turn is a very good card to overbet, whereas I would not have an overbetting range on the 10, 8, or spade. And you want to keep in mind that if you have a really, really strong hand in a spot where your opponent will have a raising range, then you're not usually going to need to overbet to stack him if you have like the nuts and he has like the second or third nuts. So for example, if this turn card was a 10 and we had pocket 8s, if our opponent has ace 10 or king 10, it's not really going to matter if we overbet the turn or if we bet smaller. We're going to end up stacking him because he's going to end up raising on the turn of the river with his ace 10 or king 10 usually. So when we have a really, really strong hand and our opponent has a raising range, we don't usually need to overbet to stack his, the top hands in his range. Whereas if our opponent doesn't have a raising range, then we do need to overbet to get our opponent to put a lot of money in the pot. So always keep that in mind. So, since I think bet sizing is one of the most widespread leaks people have right now, we have one more hand example with overbetting. So, let's say you open in the button to 2.5 big blinds and the big blind calls. Which of the following boards should you most frequently be overbetting? A king 7-3 flop with 2 spades and the turn to 7. A ace 8-4 flop that's rainbow with a turn that's an ace. A jack 10-4 flop where the turn is a queen. Or a 9-8-4 board where the turn is a 3. Again, pause for a moment and think. The answer is D. The flop was the 9 of clubs, 8 of clubs, 4 of hearts, turn 3 of diamonds. As we've mentioned before, use the general rule. If your opponent won't raise your bet, consider overbetting. Here, it's way too hard for our opponent to slow play on this flop texture. So when the turn card comes at 3, it really just didn't improve anything for him. So we should know we pretty much always have the best hand if we have something like ace 9 or better. So this is a very good board texture to overbet because our opponent's probably never going to raise us. That's not the case with the king 7-3 board where the turn was a 7 of hearts, because here the opponent can just quite simply have a 7. So this one's harder, but I don't think it's very good usually to overbet on the ace of diamonds, 8 of diamonds, 4 of clubs board with the turn ace of spades, because here the opponent can have an ace x hand, and even if he has a weak kicker, removal effects are going to make overbetting quite tricky. So for example, let's imagine we have like a hand like ace queen or ace king on the turn here. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, if we bet the flop with ace queen or ace king, and the turn's an ace of spades, how are we ever beat? And you're right, we're probably almost never beat there. But the problem is when we have an ace, we block half the aces in our opponent's range. So if we have something like ace king or ace queen and we overbet, we might make our opponent fold a lot of his hands that are like, an 8x hand, or maybe even some random like 4x hands, or, middle pairs, like, pocket 7s, pocket 9s if you can have them. And that's not really good because we're losing a lot of value by making our opponent fold hands that we wanted to call. And even if we can get extra value by overbetting against our opponent when he has, trips, when he has like ace 7, the problem is, again, when we have ace king or ace queen, we've blocked half those combos in his range. So I'm intentionally picking tricky examples here because I think if I make them easy, most people that are watching these videos are going to just get them too quickly, and, real poker's tricky. But yeah, right here, even though I think it's acceptable to overbet ace king or ace queen, I don't really like it all that much because we block half the aces in our opponent's range, and those are the hands we wanted to call. And then when we're going to be, if we were going to balance our value over bets with the overbet bluffs, when we're bluffing, we don't block any aces. So it's kind of an unfortunate thing where if we're overbetting ace king or ace queen, our opponent's not going to have an ace very often. Or if we're overbetting like a bluff, like a weak flush draw, or a flush draw is a draw. But if we're overbetting a bluff, then our opponent's going to be a lot more likely to have the actual ace. So yeah, I don't really like overbetting all that much here. Okay, if the flop is jack 10-4 with the turn queen of spades, here the opponent can have king 9, queen 10, and queen jack. And king 9's a really, really good hand. Obviously, queen 10 and queen jack are decent, a good amount weaker than that. But those are still 3 pretty strong hands the opponent can have. Nevertheless, overbetting here may not be terrible if you feel he won't raise his 2 pairs and won't have most king 9 combos in his range. So I wouldn't really overbet on this turn very often because if we have a hand like ace king and our opponent has king 9, we probably just stack him anyways. We don't need to overbet our ace king to stack our opponent when he has king 9, and we might not even need to if he has a hand like queen jack or queen 10. Queen jack and queen 10 are more debatable for whether or not our opponent should raise, check raise on the turn, but at least when our opponent has king 9 and we have ace king, we're still probably going to stack him. But if the opponent doesn't have king 9 in his range, like if he were to check raise it on the flop, then overbetting with a hand like ace king or king 9 or, a set of 4s would probably be more reasonable for us to do. So again, a relatively trickier, answer, but I don't think overbetting here is as great as the 9-8-4 board where the turn's a 3. That's just a fantastic spot to overbet. Whereas, with answer C, Jack 10-4 with the turn queen, you maybe can make an argument for it in some cases, but overall I don't think it's going to be nearly as effective. So bingo, the turn quite likely literally improved no hands in his range. It's unlikely he has 9-3, 8-3, or 4-3 hands in his range, so he just really didn't get there. And even if the opponent can have some pocket threes, which I don't think he probably does, but it will make up very, very few combos in his range. So this is just a fantastic spot to overbet. Again, almost no one does it, so if you want to start doing it, it will give you a really nice edge in some spots. Usually if we're beat on this turn with a better hand than ace-9, it's because our opponent slow played on the flop, and it's just very hard to slow play here. Question 10. Which of the following theory statements is false? In order to maximize the expected value of an entire range against an optimal opponent, the expected value of every individual hand must be maximized. B. Poker theory is usually quite good at proving or suggesting something must be wrong, but usually pretty bad at proving something must be correct. C. If we have ace-queen preflop and in theory think we should employ a mixed strategy, for example, call sometimes and 3-bet sometimes, then against an optimal opponent, we could always call and we'd never get exploited. Or D, all of the above are true. A reasonably tough question, so pause for a moment and think.
You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Think.
So the answer is D, they're all true. Against a GTO opponent, you must always take the most profitable line, no exceptions. Doing anything else leaves money on the table. I don't think too many people will have gotten this wrong. Most people know by now you always have to take the most profitable line with every individual hand against an optimal opponent. B is also, I think, reasonably obviously true, which is since we can't solve poker, we can't really ever prove anything except for on river play. So you need to allow yourself to make reasonable assumptions in order to use theory effectively, and that usually results in the theory being pretty good at proving stuff can't be correct or something must be wrong, but it's really bad for finding an actual solution. Like we don't know, we can't at all solve for what's optimal preflop, for example. This is what I think a lot of people probably picked, even though it's not the case. I see people get this concept confused pretty often in forums. So a GTO opponent will never adjust to what we do. So if two lines are in theory indifferent, meaning they have the same expected value, you can pick whichever line you want to. Because against an optimal opponent, he doesn't adjust his strategy, and if both lines have the same EV, it doesn't matter which line you pick. So personally, if I knew I was playing a GTO opponent and thought a spot called for a mixed strategy, I'd always just take the easier line. Since, in theory, both lines should have the same EV, I'm going to pick the line which I think makes me make the fewest mistakes. So, again, that's the one I think if people got this wrong, they probably picked C. And you really want to remember, an optimal opponent never adjusts to what we do. That's only something an exploitative opponent does. All right, thank you for watching. Please feel free to leave comments and ask questions in the forums. Also, post your scores. Was the quiz too easy? Was it too hard? Do you agree or do you disagree with anything? Even after having made the video, there's now a few things I would have liked to have slightly changed. And as I mentioned earlier, trying to make questions difficult and really illustrate concepts well often requires me to make questions that don't have a super clear, super obvious answer that's more debatable. So hopefully you were okay with that, but let me know in the forums. Yeah, and good luck. So thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it, and good luck at the tables. Bye.